Hey there, King Terry here, your high school history teacher. Welcome back to another History Teacher Acts video. All right, you guys recommended this one from the big guys, Kings and Generals. Their video is called What Everyone Gets Wrong About Feudalism. Feudalism is a major topic of history curriculums. And of course, a major thing that I have emphasized when talking about the social and economic history of medieval Europe. So the idea that there are some things wrong that's probably being understood about feudalism really piques my interest. Because again, this is stuff I teach, and if I can maybe add some more nuance to it, all the better. So I'm hoping to learn a lot here and hopefully make me a better teacher. All right, the original video is down below. Make sure you're supporting them. By the way, thanks to them, they were a guest on History Showdown, my history trivia game show, of which, by the way, season 1 just ended. And one of the coolest episodes we did have was with Kings and Generals. I'll link the playlist to the whole season 1 down below. All right, let's get started. All right, as you guys already saw, I am all dressed up, ready to go to talk about medieval history and feudalism. I'm both, I guess, a king and a knight who, came from noble backgrounds anyway. So I'm just all the things about the Middle Ages. Here we go. What am I getting wrong? That's what I want to know. I want to correct myself if I've been wrong.
Most people, whether fans of history or
Sick
not,
art,
will have come
art.
into contact with the concept of feudalism in one way or another, and will have...
By the way, if you don't know what that is, what feudalism is, I mean, hopefully they'll find it, and if not, I'll try to talk about it. It's basically the baseline for how European society and economics functioned essentially for centuries, and people really kind of will kind of bracket the time period around really the end of the fall of Western Rome, probably in about the 500s or so, after the disintegration of the empire and localization of rule and economy and economics, up through basically the absolute monarchy era that's you're going to see in the late Middle Ages. Anyway, I interrupted too early.
Will have come into contact with the concept of feudalism in one way or another, and will have heard terms such as feudalism, vassals, and lords used to describe the legal and social structures that made up the period known as the Middle Ages.
Up there.
This is understandable, as up until the 1990s, the majority of historical research assumed that the feudal pyramid was the overarching system that defined the economic, social, and military fabric of the medieval era.
I really like the parallax art. So you have like the 2D art, right? But the parallax, meaning, different parts of it moving at different rates. It's how our eyes work, right? So stuff in the distance doesn't move very much when you move, and things closer to you move. It's how our eyes work. I always like that. It brings 3 dimensions to, flat art that way. But yeah, usually when it comes to the European Middle Ages, there has been such a rigid framework, I think, that has been applied to it. Every time I learn about something really kind of new or whatever, it just shows basically that things are more complicated, or things aren't as bad, or things aren't as good, that you might hear about. Because the famous sort of thing that's gone down, I guess, label for the Middle Ages, you heard of the Dark Ages, right? It's a very kind of like Eurocentric, but also devalues actually a lot of what was going on in Europe at that time. And it's usually framed in that way where it's like, the era of absolute monarchy and then the Renaissance and stuff was this super enlightened era, bringing Europe out of its backwardness, and it had gone into this backwardness after the greatness of the Romans. Like literally just some light switch flipped off and everything just went to crap in the Middle Ages, and everybody just became stupid and this and that. And yeah, it's just like you got to give people in history more respect, I think.
However, the feudal system and its origins have been much less clean cut in light of more recent research.
Okay.
Modern historians are far more divided as to when and how the feudal system came into being, and whether it is at all suitable for describing the complexity of the European Middle Ages with its...
If I get a chance here, I'll be able to talk about kind of how I think just in a larger sense, how educators have kind of talked about the roots of European feudalism. If there's something different that he says, I'll try to interject there.
at all suitable for describing the complexity of the European Middle Ages, with its many regionalisms, cultures, legal systems, and forms of organization. With these introductory words, we welcome you to our video, in which we explore what everyone got wrong about the feudal system.
Awesome.
And how our understanding of it has changed in the present day.
I like that I like the idea for videos in general about, what people are getting wrong, or, things that we aren't talking about. I think those things are really important, rather than just saying the same things about stuff we already assume, over and over and over again. It's like, what are you adding? What's the new thing that we can add to this, right? Add some depth. And again, nuance, that term nuance, which is like, you kind of complicate things, you balance things out in a way.
Every week, we release 3 new exclusive videos for our members and patrons. The Pacific War, the Eastern Front of World War II Prelude, and many other series, including the War of Spanish Succession, Punic Wars, Iberian Reconquista, Russian Revolution and Civil War, North African and Italian campaigns of World War II, and much more. It has been long overdue, but we have finally created a YouTube channel exclusively for our Kings and Generals podcasts. Please go and check out Kings and Generals podcast, home to the Pacific War Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast. Link in the description and pinned comment. To see those, as well as get access to our exclusive Discord, see our schedule, and get early access to all videos, join the ranks of our patrons and YouTube members via the links in the description and pinned comment. Thanks to our supporters for allowing us to continue doing our dream job.
Before we get to the deconstruction of the feudal system, we should first take a look at the outlines of older research. The classical model by which historians understood the emergence of medieval feudalism developed at the turn of the 20th century, and still filled university handbooks as late as the 1980s.
Okay, so fairly recent, I guess you could say. And we'll see what take he gives. I'm interested to see what he says is the classical take.
This model assumed that the feudal system developed in the 8th century, under the Carolingian dynasty, which...
I'd argue that I've always argued that it's when Western Rome, as it disintegrates more and more, which again, it didn't happen overnight. Okay, 476, the final Western Roman emperor deposed, but Rome was already on a massive decline. By the time the Western Roman Empire fell apart, population was much smaller. It was like 10% of what it was at its height. That feudalism was rising as the Roman Empire was falling. So if you're doing that, you got to put that centuries earlier. I've never really said it starts with the Frankish Empire and beginning of the Holy Roman Empire.
Practiced components of vassalage and fiefdoms inherited from the late Roman Empire. The idea of commendation, as well as the customs of the early Germanic people.
It's like 300 years
The term commendation derives from the Latin si commendare, to entrust oneself to someone. In the final centuries of the Western Roman Empire, it was a practice where a free man placed himself under the protection of a more powerful man in order to receive a form of maintenance and protection.
Fair. Yeah, fair. With the Roman Empire's disintegration, and you don't have these large imperial states like Rome to basically run the economy, provide protection, provide infrastructure and all that, you end up localizing all of those things, localizing the economy, the rule, all of that. That's always, at least for me, been kind of talking about what the origins were. Feudalism rises in power vacuums, essentially.
In return, the subordinate was now obliged to serve and obey his new lord.
Right.
This form of subordination was not exactly attractive, as one was a subject to a master out of unfavorable reasons.
But the idea was you did that, you pledged this service loyalty because you essentially can't survive on your own, at least not long-term with long-term stability. You need somebody near you that has the means to be able to help you survive. So protection, of course, food, work, all those things you need to be able to live long life. And with the Roman Empire gone, that becomes more localized, right? Who's the person locally that has that kind of power? Who can grow food and protect it and take those basic survival needs for you, right?
Nevertheless, this was a common practice in late antiquity and the early Middle Ages.
Sure.
The other, more attractive personal component of vassalage was thought to have emerged from the oaths of allegiance sworn by warriors and lesser chiefs towards greater chiefs among the ancient Germanic peoples.
Correct.
However, this practice was likely not Germanic in origin. It was probably an adoption of Roman military oaths.
That's fair. That's fair. Loyalty, especially from the military, right? People had pledged their loyalty. And by the time the Western Roman Empire was falling, a famous trope you might have heard of was that people were more, and their army was so vast, right? And foreign, like, to them, because it was getting so big. But that you pledged your loyalty was far more to your commander, your boss, than the idea of like some partial deity emperor that may live hundreds or thousands of miles away back in Rome, a place you've never gone to, in your life. And that totally makes sense. How loyalty is going to be more localized the larger your empire is, the more indirect it is. So I never thought of it that way as like I never really talked about it as like a Germanic thing necessarily. Although, well, actually, no, that's not true. I do. I have at least said that, but it doesn't mean that it can't be both. It's not like an invention. It's something. Feudalism is something that happens naturally because it's not a European thing. It's happened all over the place. Okay. The famous parallel, of course, is Japan with their city states and their whole parallels with daimyo, who are lords, and samurai, who are, noble servants of the society, just like knights are, that kind of thing. And even in the modern era, in war-torn regions, a lot of these lords might be referred to as warlords, especially if they're seen as your enemies, but they are people that basically protect you and offer you a livelihood. So yeah. So I guess it's right and wrong, at least maybe how I've talked about it.
Which were first adopted. It was probably an adoption of Roman military oaths, which were first adopted by the Germanic peoples when they entered into the service of the empire after migrating into Roman territory, and in continued use by the powerful even after the end of the Roman Empire in the West.
Well, the thing is, it's mutually exclusive, right? Like, if you are a potential lord, you have this kingdom, but like, okay, great, but like, what protects your assets? What protects this land that you supposedly control, this food that you control, these geographic regions you control? You require people. The whole feudalism structure is supposed to be kind of about I scratch your back, you scratch my back. We can't survive without each other, right? These everyday people need that type of infrastructure. They need that type of livelihood that can be stabilized. But at the same time, these noble inherited people that inherit this nobility need people who's working the land, right? Who's actually protecting the people, right? It's a mutually exclusive thing. And there were benefits, obviously, to pledging or loyalty, right?
These forms of allegiance formed the personal basis for medieval vassalage as it was understood by 20th century historians. Older research assumed that fiefs, the material component of feudalism, could be found in abundance in the sources of the 8th and 9th centuries under the term beneficium. Mostly, these beneficia were legal transactions in the widely used legal practice of the precarium.
Sorry, there are fireworks going on in the background.
Practice, a person is
it is a state holiday where I am, so it's very loud.
Asked for the temporary use of another person's property, usually land, without the borrower receiving ownership rights.
Let me go back. I'm sorry, that was super distracting for me.
Used legal practice of the precarium loan. In this practice, a person is asked for the temporary use of another person's property, usually land, without the borrower receiving ownership rights. The reasons for entering into such an agreement were manifold, and mostly favorable for both parties.
Right.
However, what was most important about this precarium loan was its flexibility in usage and the fact that it created social ties by dividing ownership and use between two parties for a certain period of time.
The thing that I think, just like setting myself up for when he's going to talk more about the things we're getting wrong, I think the thing I'm most ready to reassess is that maybe the feudal system was a lot more flexible than we think. Okay, the general idea is that it's just this super, super rigid thing, and you had these very clear class distinctions, right? Serfs are going to be born into serfs, and every serf is the same or whatever, and the nobles are going to all be doing the same thing, and that's super rigid, and there was no differentiation. But like that, the fluidity of it, I think, is the thing that I would be most easily persuaded on. I'm almost like primed to do that.
Dividing ownership and use between two parties for a certain period of time. Older scholarship translated most of these precarium loans on the basis that these were particularly favorable to the person requesting them, simply as fiefs, and concluded that they were issued by lords to vassals in return for military service.
So fief, think like me, the king here, right? I have all of this land that supposedly I claim to or whatever. And I mean, what good is land and your claim to land if you can't defend it and actually operate it? Which is why you need people loyal to you. Like, even if I'm the king, I need people, and not just a whole 100%. Like, it's just, it can't just be me and then the other 99.99% or whatever is going to be the serfs. You need other powerful people, right? You need other powerful people that have wealth and access and I don't know, political power in their region. So it's like, this is where that noble class is going to be big. Now, again, but by far the majority of people in Europe are considered serfs, which is a term that people will say it's differentiated between like a peasant being a serf is somewhere maybe between like what you consider a peasant and a slave. It's like, you've never seen as like transferable property as much as you might see with chattel slavery, but you definitely aren't just like free. You're basically bound to the land. And if somebody else comes to take over the land, it's kind of like you almost like come with it. You're kind of, stuck to it. You're bound to that land. Anyway, so fiefdoms are places like almost like little kingdoms, communities that are given by a powerful person to a lesser powerful person, right? From like, I think of like a king to a lord, and that lord operates that. And of course, when the king, me here, when I need help, I need to raise an army, I need money, I need support, whatever it is. Those lords are going to come, right? They're going to come up there because they're the ones that are actually organizing all the labor. They're the ones that are connecting me, the king, with the other noble classes that are, and we'll see if they talk about knighthood, with knights and like a military force, those sort of things, right? Not just like a two-class system. It's I guess multi-tiered that way. But it still often comes down to you're born into it, right? To whatever class. And that's, though, like I said earlier, I'm flexible to think about.
Thus,
reconsider.
In a short time, the elements of personal loyalty in the form of commendation and warrior oaths merged with the granting of land in the form of precarium loans, and formed the feudal system, whereby the warlike period of the 8th century in particular was thought to be a catalyst leading to the development of the feudal system. The driving force for the spread of this new practice was thought to be the need for more cavalry soldiers.
I had always kind of just felt, though, that it had already existed, but before the middle-aged 700s are coming down, when the Franks are really centralizing things. But am I wrong? Because he's saying that's the classical standpoint, which I guess I hadn't been doing.
Spread of this new practice
that was
thought to be the need for more cavalry soldiers. It was suggested that besides the internal struggle for supremacy over the realm of the Franks, the confrontation with forces from the border regions of Europe led to a change in the composition of the Frankish army.
So think of all the different little mini states or tribes of people who the Franks are the ones that are really going to sort of rise to the cream of the crop. Basically, the most powerful entity since Western Rome had fallen are going to be the Franks, right? They're going to, either consolidate or eliminate so much that they become the biggest of the groups, by the way. AKA the Carolingians. But I don't know. I don't like to use all the different terms. Like, there's too many terms for the same thing. I just continue to call them the Franks.
Contact with the agile led to a change in the composition of the Frankish army.
Artwork's sweet, by the way.
Contact with the agile cavalry warriors of the Arabian sphere and the Avars, as well as the need for a rapid reaction force against the raids of the Norsemen, Frankish armoured horsemen had replaced
Vikings.
peasant foot soldiers. As the more expensive and time-consuming equestrian service required greater material resources than that of a foot soldier, the horsemen needed to be financially equipped.
Sure. Yeah. And to be actual, like, ready, I guess, to fight, they've got to be highly trained, right? They're professionals that way. That's the other thing where serfdom plays a role, which is like, how can you allow a certain class, if you want to call them a portion of your society, to basically have the professional training required to protect your kingdom? And that's where I guess you would say the justification for these nobles, right, to be able to train knights. Otherwise, you just become like they were saying, just a conscripted foot soldier. Right, war comes out and you just give somebody an axe and you're like, all right, go fight. Good luck. I guess here's a day of training about how to swing an axe or sword or something like that. But these guys, and when it comes to cavalry, like fighting is not just something you just can just wake up one day and be like, I'm going to do this. It takes years of training. It's an incredible amount of work. So this whole society, I guess you would say, and part of society with knights in this noble class, required the foundation of an agricultural serf class, I guess you could say.
This is where the practice of granting fiefdoms in the form of precarium loans was believed to have intensified. It was stated that Charles Martel had requisitioned property from the large lands that church institutions held.
He's the granddaddy,
and issued it as fiefs to his
Franks
men in order to obtain more cavalry warriors that were bound to him as vassi with the above-mentioned practices. However,
I just assumed it was
Pippin the
earlier.
Younger and Karlman, the sons of Charles Martel, wanted to return the requisitioned property to the church in the middle of the 8th century.
Carmelone.
Naturally, both kings did not want to go without the military potential of their vassi, and could not simply dispossess them of the granted lands. So they resorted to a trick. The church received their land back, but had to hand it over directly to the vassi as precarium loans, who could thus continue to perform their military service for the king.
By the way, something I think that's important for context here was, the Germanic tribes that are known for, there's a bunch of them, right, that go and conquer Rome, weren't Christian. Some of them had converted or whatever, but like basically when Western Rome fell, Christianity in a lot of ways almost like could have died out, I think, especially if a powerful group like the Franks were actively trying to eradicate it because they were powerful enough to probably influence religion at that time. But the Franks converted to Christianity. And I think that's a huge moment that maybe doesn't get talked enough about the history of Christianity, that basically the biggest entity post-Roman Empire, which was officially Christian by the end in the West there, the biggest entity is basically going to continue Christianity rather than try to eradicate it. And in fact, it spread. In fact, Christianity spread with the Frankish Empire into places that it had not been practiced, right, outside of what the former Roman Empire was, because these guys originate in areas much further north than where Rome was. And through this era, this is when it's going to start to make its way even further up. And you're going to get the Norse, right? The Vikings are going to start converting at this time period as well. So yeah, I don't think maybe it gets talked about in the history of Christianity to actually how important the Franks were. Now we'll see if he gets, I don't know if it's even relevant when Charlemagne, who's going to be coming down in the succession of the Franks, when he and the Pope basically come unify and create the Holy Roman Empire out of thin air.
This model quickly spread throughout the Frankish Empire,
so it's coming up.
And ecclesiastical and secular magnates adopted it. From their own property, or from land that they themselves had received as a fiefdom from the king, they gave land to their subordinates as a sub-fief.
Someone's got to work it.
It was also thought that many officers, such as bishoprics, dukes, and counts, were bound to the king in this way as vassals. Thus,
by the way, this becomes dramatic for the investiture controversy, War of the Bucket for oversimplified heads, which is who appoints church officials across Europe. Should it be the Pope or it should be the king? That's something that's going to be literally fought over, not just debated, but fought over basically for centuries. in Europe.
Early medieval society under the Carolingians was believed to have become a feudal society, shaped by a straightforward system that was based on land grants for personal loyalty
it's almost too
between
large,
lords and vassals.
It's almost like it's too large to truly be totally feudal. But we'll see if it gets to it. This empire breaks apart pretty soon here, which is just going to open up the door for more feudalism.
As control over land was the central resource in the early Middle Ages, it was thought that besides military organization, politics and the economy developed alongside the lines of the feudal system.
Right.
Over time, the hereditary nature of the fiefs developed, so that the king's access to the landed property of the nobility, and thus the royal power, dwindled. The feudal system mutated. The monograph Fiefs and Vassals, the medieval evidence reinterpreted
again, the empire's going to break
by
apart.
British historian Susan Reynolds, released in 1994, presented a particular turning point for this model of the social structure of the early Middle Ages, and thus the subsequent development of the medieval epoch.
What'd she say?
Reynolds' critique mostly pointed out that research up to this point had often interpreted and translated terms found in the early medieval sources in a too narrow view. She rightly noted that words such as vassal or fief are not as commonplace in the sources as they are made out to be. Moreover, when they do appear, they do not automatically have to be read in the model of the feudal system.
So if they're not using those as much, then maybe it wasn't as rigid of a structure. So again, the thing I was kind of assuming, I think they would be going here, and the easiest thing to be able to argue is that it wasn't as structured as probably we think, right? Seems like that's unfolding here.
They do not automatically have to be read in the model of the feudal system, especially not in the context of a lord-vassal relationship that is mostly based on military service. Yet, older research did exactly that, and was thus very intentional and one-sided with the translation of source terms. As already mentioned, terms such as vassi and beneficia can be found in the charters originating in the Frankish world from the 6th century onwards.
They do exist. These terms
However,
exist.
Susan Reynolds showed that these terms were rarely as unambiguous in the early Middle Ages as older research depicted them. Only on rare occasions were the charters of the time precise in the terminology and usage.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like we thought everybody just had a stamp on their forehead about their like class and who they're loyal to and their job, and all that stuff was just imprinted on you, serf of Lord whatever, bottom tooth.
Thus, the interpretation as a lord and vassal relationship who exchanged loyalty and lands for military service, advice, and protection is only in very few cases the most likely. Similarly, a large number of other words such as fidelis, confidante, hominis, and militias were liberally interpreted as vassals and thought of directly in the context of feudalism, without taking into account the ambiguity of these terms or the precise background they might have in a charter.
Kind of seems like the legality, if you want to call it that, of these relationships wasn't what we thought, you know, these terms, like put it in paper in a contract and all this stuff. You know, maybe for some people when it comes to like land ownership and stuff, but remember, we're still talking about a society that is massively serf peasants.
In many cases, however, the sources distinguish quite clearly between these different terms, and do not depict them in any form of a lord and vassal relationship. The term beneficium is also far more ambiguous in its use in the sources. It encompasses a
like
range of
terms of the
phenomena and
contract
practices corresponding to its basic meaning of a benefice, and could refer to a broad range of land loans or benefiting events.
Right.
Historical research from the 1930s and 40s were not unaware of this, but undertook the step of excluding all beneficia from the peasant-rural area of life from their consideration, as these so-called peasant fiefs could not be compared with knightly or vassal fiefdoms.
Sure. I mean, let's be honest too, when it comes to just the reality. Peasants ain't reading. They ain't read good. They don't read. Literacy sucked in this era. It was basically reserved for the nobility. Because what reading ability, by the way, do you need to be a full-time serf? By the way, something else I'm very open-minded to is maybe debunking that stigma of the lack of literacy and a lot of education for serfs. I'm primed to believe that's been mistold as well.
Unsurprisingly, this artificial scientific separation led to a narrowing of the terms, which otherwise would have had a variety of meanings and uses in the early medieval sources. Furthermore, regional developments and local particularities were not really taken into further consideration while interpreting the sources. Thus, the terminology in the sources must be taken seriously in the context of the individual source, because what a vassus provided and what the beneficium was that was received is often not as clearly stated as the concept of feudalism makes it out to be.
You know, and just to add nuance to the nuance that they are bringing in, maybe just because of these legality of these these deals doesn't necessarily mean that in practicality that was still practiced. Especially the loyalty things he's talking about. So, you know, just because maybe it's not as explicitly shown in this documentation doesn't necessarily mean that those relationships and the way that we think of them, like those didn't exist. Does that make sense?
In addition, some of the basic developments that are assumed by older research about the origins of the feudal system are not as strongly proven as they seem, and have since been reconsidered in the wake of Reynolds' studies. To begin with, the assertion of older research that Charles Martel confiscated church property and issued it in exchange for military service is not proven. In fact, there is hardly any evidence for the confiscation of church property on a broad basis from the sources of Charles Martel's time. The fact that Pippin the Younger and his brother Carloman restituted church property under their reign is also not based on a large number of surviving precarium loan contracts.
Remember, these relationships between the Franks and the church were also mutually beneficial because they gave justification to each other's rule. It's like, okay, this can be the religion here and can operate because the political leaders like the Franks allow it. And then vice versa, you know, the justifying the rule of these people in this royal family has its basis also in the dominant religion. This has been such an important thing in the history of society, is the cross-justifying of politics and religion. See it all over the place, every part of the world.
But only on the result of a single synod held in 743 or 744.
Synod? I always call them synods.
Although this synod mentions the connection between military service and precarium loans, it speaks of an impending war for which church property was to equip warriors for a limited period of time. There is no hint that this was a common practice,
raise armies,
or that it had the restitution of an already alienated property at its core. Furthermore, the idea that officials such as bishops, counts, and dukes were bound to the king as vassals is one formed on a foundation of sand.
Yeah, no, totally true. We saw it with the investiture controversy. Where is the loyalty? Who even appoints those? Specifically with like the bishops, dukes, and whatever. Yeah, that's a more political thing. You know, there's so many different titles, and I remember asking somebody this, and was it in a live stream or something like that? You know how there's just like an insane amount of titles that you hear about in this era. It's like you're a duke and you're a grand duke and you're an archduke and then you're like this and that, you know, all the different things. And I was just like, were they just making up names to make certain people feel important? And it seems like by Occam's razor, essentially, that's the case. Like more likely than not, yeah, they were making titles and pulling them out of their butt to keep powerful people happy and make them feel important, so that you can keep your rule, and then they can feel good about whatever nobility they think they are entitled to. Do y'all agree about that?
During the whole Carolingian period,
it's like there's no reason to have as many as there were of titles.
Vassals is one formed on a foundation of sand. During the whole Carolingian period, sources differentiated between vassals of the king and holders of office, the latter often singled out by the officer's terminology.
Well, they weren't really voting
for
him, though.
The vassals are strictly separated in enumerations in the sources, and find themselves behind the magnates and holders
There's no
of
democracy.
Office. Newer research suggests that the binding between an office and a corresponding fief only emerged in the 12th and 13th centuries, with the emergence of stronger institutionalization in the proto-state. Thus,
I mean, yeah, I guess we're seeing that, post-Crusades as well. There's a lot more centralization starting in, the 12th century, because that's when the Crusades are going to go. And the France that we know of, and by the way, we're jumping way ahead to what we were talking about with the Franks. Actually, he's already showing it on screen here without talking about it. See where it says Holy Roman Empire and then Francia. That was all basically the Frankish Empire at one time, and then it split, actually, specifically after Charlemagne. But there you go. But yeah, the kingdoms of England and France, and a lot of these are going to be very defining things that you're going to see. Yeah, 11th and 12th century, you're going to get the Normans taking over the English, and Vikings kind of getting the boot. The France as we know it starting to be consolidated around this time. And that makes more sense because there's going to be more formality to leadership positions when you start having these more centralized, kingdoms. You're starting to put it down and you're starting to write it, and there's contracts and all that stuff, because, in a more feudal time, things can be a lot less formalized, I guess.
Bishops, counts, and dukes were not bound to the king as vassals by a hierarchical structure of fiefs, but by other means of loyalty, trust, and consensus within the elite.
That's what I was saying, yeah. And again, though, these people are, and without there being contract, these people are not going to be able to be in power without the permission of these kings. I mean, they can raise armies and stuff like that. They can apply force. So it's not like anybody's going to be able to do this and just be able to be openly defiant of the king or something, because we are moving into the centralization of Europe.
To make matters worse, the German historian Roman Deutinger pointed out that he could not make out one single sub-vassal in the sources of the Frankish Empire from the 8th and 9th centuries. As we have demonstrated, the historical reality contained in the early medieval sources was much more diverse than the historical reality reconstructed by older research. So much more diverse, in fact, that the concept of feudalism is unable to capture it.
Well, where you could really defend this hypothesis about the decentralization is what the Holy Roman Empire we know actually looked like. It was not a real empire. It was a whole bunch of different autonomous kingdoms that were semi-unified under an emperor. And that was about it. There's tons of them, right? There's tons of them. So really, those things had already existed right before this empire, and that is a result naturally of feudalism.
To use the words of Roman Deutinger, a system that allows a myriad of exceptions and can only be proven in a few individual cases is no longer a system, but simply a fiction.
That's just like evidence of absence absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, though. That's what I would say to counter this.
Today, the image of Carolingian rule is, therefore, less one of a centralized empire with the system of feudalism as its dominating structure at its core, and more one of diverse personal ties and practices, which...
Well, that's literally what feudalism is, though. If you're talking about an empire running the show here, it's really not feudalism anymore, though.
Which were used skillfully and flexibly by contemporaries, opening up relationships that went far beyond the duality of lord and vassal. Therefore, the birthplace and time of feudalism as a system in Europe lies elsewhere. According to Susan Reynolds and others, the origins of feudalism lie in northern Italy in the late 11th and early 12th centuries. During those centuries, the emerging jurists of that region studied the Roman law codes that had remained in partial legal use in Italy long after the fall of the Roman Empire.
Partially. Yeah, partially. It's completely broken up. Yeah, the city-states are going to start forming here. And that, in a way, too, is also parallels with feudalism. Essentially, a handful of families in these different regions, like Milan, Genoa, Venice, Pisa, etc., and Florence, are going to kind of rise again to the cream of the crop because of their financial prowess. And that, by the way, really, really started to expand as a result of the Crusades, as Italy was such an important place when it came to kind of being the middleman for Europeans coming from England and France, going through Italy and making their way eventually to the Crusades. A lot of wealth was generated in Italy at that time. That's where a lot of these families are going to start to build their businesses and their power, say like the Medici's in Florence.
Inspired by the clear structure of the Roman law codes, these early lawyers tried to structure, categorize, and regulate the diverse practices regarding noble inheritance, loyalty, fiefs, land loans, military duty, breaches of duty, and the difference between a noble and a commoner's fief. Moreover, they tried to stratify who was even able to be granted a fiefdom, and on what basis.
Corruption. Hella corrupt, all this stuff. It was like, you're giving it to your friends and family. I mean, that's what it is. That's what history shows us, right? It's not a random lot of some lottery of who gets a fief.
Who was even able to be granted a fiefdom, and on what
Nepotism.
basis. Within these treatises, the legal scholars attempted to make a strong connection between fiefs and vassalage. In doing so, the jurists attempted to break down the diverse legal practices of their own environment, which often gave rise to conflicts, in order to create basic and clear-cut normative principles that would result in regional stability and easier work for them.
Sure.
Within this,
efficiency,
the strict categories and terms of vassals and lords and their relationship along the idea of vassalage emerged. Through the increased spread of these texts and the intensified dissemination of written and codified law in Europe in the 12th and 13th centuries, the work of these Italian jurists was more and more used to define what a fief was.
But are we saying here that it's these guys that like invented it? Like it didn't start until this, or is this just where it's being further codified? You know what I mean? Because then what was going on before this, if not feudalism, right? Is it just now there's written evidence?
Thereby separating the concept of a fief from other forms of land loans and practices.
And that
Reynolds argues that in the later 16th century, lawyers specializing in feudal law took up these texts in order to explain the medieval world and its ruling mechanisms,
or to justify their own rule as a continuance of, I don't know, tradition or whatever.
Texts in order to explain the medieval world and its ruling mechanisms, according to these legal texts. Historians of the 19th century then took on this early modern picture as their own canvas, to paint models and systems of the Middle Ages on it. When this critique is taken seriously, one concludes that the common idea of a universal feudal system was just that, the idea of jurists who tried to categorize and differentiate the diverse practices of human ways of life and their connections into only a few strict cases and categories. Where does this leave historiography?
That more explains like how we know about feudalism rather than what had been going on, I think, for centuries.
Into only a few strict cases and categories. Where does this leave historiography with regard to the feudal system?
Sure.
Today, most historians follow Reynolds' critique and thought, with some added nuances of their own. In recent years, historians have suggested using a more source-oriented terminology for the early Middle Ages, in order to move away from the artificial terms and unfitting translations previously used in the research discourse when it comes to fiefs and vassals in the early and high Middle Ages.
Do you think it just becomes more of like a semantic argument? It's like, okay, they weren't calling it fiefs or they weren't calling it vassals or something, but like, what was going on? Was that still, you know, what it was? It's just called something else? Because that seems probable to me.
Furthermore, regional studies on feudalism and its corresponding origins and particularities became a staple in research. In doing so, historians try to grasp the facts and concepts of fiefdoms, vassals, loans, personal relations, and so forth that are definitely present in the sources as close to the sources as possible.
Do you want a fief?
After all, the lending of land, offices, sovereignty, and property rights remains a defining phenomenon in medieval European history. More videos about history's most common misconceptions are on the way, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see
Love that kind of stuff.
Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting, and sharing. It helps immensely.
Love it.
Our patrons and YouTube members can watch more than 200 exclusive videos. Join their ranks via the link in the description or by pressing the join button under the video
History of
to
Middle
watch
Earth.
these weekly videos.
Almost 8 hours? Yo, they're doing... Wait, do they know that... Wait, did they not know Middle Earth's not real? Or am I wrong?
Learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.
Heck yeah. Final thoughts. All right, if you stayed with me to this point, then you heard kind of all my arguments, things that, you know, buying into and things that maybe not as much or something, or I don't know, even maybe providing a counter to the counterclaim, that kind of thing. So let me know what you think down below about what they said, maybe what I said, and what you think. And I love the idea, though, if they're going to, you know, keep talking about these things about what people get wrong, or not even necessarily like debunking, but just adding more interpretation and more nuance to it. That is so important. It's so important. And we should always be doing that continuously. Just like how we do this in science. We test things. When new evidence comes out, we change our hypotheses and stuff like that. History is the same method, right? It's completely dependent on what we know, and it becomes and what we can know. And it's easy to just get into dogma, just like that can happen in science, you know, whatever. But anyway, yeah, let me know what you guys think. Again, just like how they were thanking everybody that supports them. Thank you to channel members. Thank you to Patreon members, channel members, YouTube channel members. You got to see this first, got to see this, you know, earlier than the public release. So incentive if you want to do that, but links to all that stuff is down below. And thanks for suggesting this. Best place to do that is on the Discord server. Join it and hang out with us. All right, we'll see you all next time.